Good afternoon. I am Gillian Lester, Dean of the Columbia Law School, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today for the first installment of the Ambedkar Law Lecture Series, which will be delivered in just a few moments by our distinguished guest speaker, Pratap, Bhanu, Mehta. Welcome, Professor Mehta, and thank you for being with us today. I'm especially pleased to welcome you as our inaugural speaker in this new lecture series named for Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and created through a gift to Columbia University from the Government of India. Dr. Ambedkar was one of the most important constitutional thinkers and democratic theorists of the 20th century, often described as the father of the Indian Constitution. I'm also very proud that Dr. Ambedkar studied here at Columbia, an institution that is deeply committed to advancing legal and political thought in the areas of justice, equality, and the structures of democracy. Our hope with this lecture series is to further our collective understanding of freedom in the modern world. Each time we meet, convening for 2 days of lectures and conversation led by eminent intellectual leaders of our time. This year, the first lecture will be delivered today with comments from Professors Jamal Greene and Katerina Pistor, both professors in the law school. The second lecture, which will take place in this same room on Thursday, March 31st, will feature commentary by Professor David Bromwich from Yale University. Following the comments today and on Thursday, there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. And on Thursdays, after Thursday's event, there will be a cocktail reception in the adjacent room. Before introducing our distinguished speaker and ceding the podium, I'd like to take a moment to thank the professors from the law school who've been instrumental in creating this new lecture series. I want to thank Professors Jamal Greene, Madhav, Khosla, and Jed Purdy. I'd also like to thank the staff of the law school who worked very, very hard to make this event a reality and make it all run so smoothly. I also want to make sure that I thank Professors Greene and Pistor, who will be making comments on today's lecture. Okay, now it's my honor to introduce Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Professor Mehta is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University and Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. Professor Mehta is a prolific political theorist whose work has been published widely in both the academic and popular press. In addition to serving as Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University in India, he has taught at Harvard, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and has been a member of the global faculty at NYU Law School. Professor Mehta has also been a longtime advisor to the Government of India and has recently co-edited the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution. He holds a BA from Oxford University and a PhD in politics from Princeton. Professor Mehta, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the podium. Thank you again.
It is indeed a great honor for me to deliver this lecture, and frankly, probably the most intimidating academic occasion that I've ever faced. Intimidating for a number of reasons. First, this extraordinary setting. Second, the consciousness of the fact that this lecture bears Dr. Ambedkar's name. Normally, when we think of great thinkers, great political actors, we hold them up to some yardstick of greatness or some measure of moral worth. I think what makes Dr. Ambedkar distinctive is that he is the measure of greatness and moral worth. Probably one of the most outstanding thinkers and activists of the 20th century. He once described his ideal of a great thinker in this wonderful essay on Rana Day, where he says, "A great man must be motivated by the dynamics of social purpose and must act as the scourge and scavenger of society." And I think when he wrote those words, he was probably, I think they apply to him as much as they do to the people he was praising. So I think anybody who any event that bears his name, I think, carries a special responsibility. I'm deeply grateful to Dean Gillian Lester for organizing this event and taking the leadership, Professor Jamal, Greene, Purdy, and Madhav Khosla for conceptualizing the event. And last but not least, the discussants, Professor Katrina Pistor and Professor Jamal Greene, whose work in some senses has set really new benchmarks on how to think about the future shape our politics should and ought to take. And that's also a source of intimidation. The topic I have chosen for these two lectures is the idea of political resentment. And I have to confess that in part this topic was suggested to me, as I'll probably become clearer in the second lecture than in the first one, by some of Dr. Ambedkar's writings, where he does, in passing, often wrestle with the issue of resentment. In fact, he comes up with a very distinctive take on what a proper form or sympathetic, emancipatory kind of resentment might look like, which I'll gesture at in the second lecture. And it seemed to me, I think given the distemper of our political times in all the democracies that we inhabit, at least the two that I know of, India and the United States, that it might bear some collective reflection. And if nothing else, it'll provoke Professors Pistorian, Jamal Greene, and David Bromwich to, I think, enlighten us on this important subject. So it's an obvious fact, I think, if you read any newspaper, a lot of the literature that is produced these days, that resentment casts an ominous shadow on democratic politics. The crisis of democracy in almost every decade is associated often with a politics of resentment. In the 1950s, Hannah Arendt had captured the relationship between democracy and resentment quite poignantly. In the 1970s, Gary Wills described American politics as, quote, vomiting resentment. This was just around the time the Trilateral Commission was worrying about the fate of democracy. Now, of course, we associate resentment with the rise of populism and nationalism. If you take bestsellers like The Hillbilly Elegy, which catalogs a wide-ranging set of accumulated resentments. On J.D. Vance's account, many sections of American society, especially elites, act in ways that give others good reasons to resent them, which leads to a vicious cycle. Others display their resentment, and elites in turn resent the fact that they are being resented. If you pick up any newspaper in my country, India, or another old democracy, you'd be forgiven if you came away with the impression that every section of society was brimming with quote-unquote resentment against some other group, nationalists against liberals and leftists, upper castes against lower castes for demanding affirmative action, and increasingly and tragically, pretty much everybody against Muslims. Pankaj Mishra describes this as an age of anger. And one of India's best-selling books, a very popular author, Amish, there's a blurb to his book that goes something like, India is beset with division and resentment. To political agents, resentment seems to provide a source of meaning and self-esteem in our time. And as Frederick Jameson suggested many years ago, resentment also seems to be a catch-all explanation for much of the politics of our times. Now, of course, there is a lot of exaggeration in this. Right? One has to be careful in attributing resentment to a particular group, political movement, or an individual. The attribution of resentment often has ideological uses. After all, what better way to delegitimize the moral and political claims of a group or an individual other than by describing them as being motivated by resentment? By invoking psychological categories such as resentment, we sometimes obscure the material, ideological, and institutional conflicts at play in our politics. But that said, there are certain ideological movements, like nationalism, where it is difficult to capture the affective dimension of those movements without invoking terms like political resentment. And political movements often themselves try and go to great lengths to demonstrate that whatever other failings they might have, their desire for justice is not motivated by resentment. There is a fear that even when justified, the taint of resentment can delegitimize any kind of moral and political claims. Now, these two lectures, today and on Thursday, are a kind of tour de horizon of the moral and political subjectivity that might be involved in a politics of resentment. The distinction between subjectivity broadly and political subjectivity is harder to sustain in our contemporary moment. Resentment directed at politics today, at least today, has a special knack of turning one's political subjectivity into one's identity or political subjectivity or subjectivity full stop. There is often a complaint made about contemporary politics in all our democracies, and perhaps in non-democracies as well, that politics has become a staging ground for identities. This fact about our politics is supposed to explain its uncompromising character and represent a danger to democracy. If only we could put aside identity politics for something else, common deliberation, class interests, something else, our democracies would be healthier, or at least so the refrain goes. Now, there are two issues with a claim of this kind, just as a kind of preliminary thought. One, of course, as I said, these attributions of resentment fail to distinguish between claims that are advanced on the basis of identity, that are in fact claims for justice or inclusion on the one hand, and claims that are mere assertions of an inherited identity privilege on the other. So just because something is being called as being fueled by resentment doesn't mean we should stop making those distinctions about where resentment might be appropriate. But there seems to be even a deeper problem here, because one of the hallmarks of our time seems to be not that we bring preformed identities to politics and seek to colonize politics by invoking identity claims, but it is rather the reverse, that there seems to be a kind of resentment that is directed at politics as such that forms the basis of our identity and colonizes much of ourselves. And I'll come to this point back later in the lecture. These lectures take a step back from this current moment. They try to give the idea of resentment some shape by offering brief reflections on several themes that I take to be at the heart of a politics of resentment. And I give them sort of 7 kind of names: authority, sympathy, status, and agency. And these are the 4 I'll be talking about today. And then there are 3 other, as it were, manifestations of politics of resentment, what I call personification, memory, and naming. These have to do with the need to assign blame, the politics of memory, and the politics of naming and defining our identities that I'll talk about on Thursday. But running like a red thread through all of these 7 tropes that I'll discuss is the idea that at the heart of resentment is some sense of frustrated or thwarted agency. Each of these 7 tropes will involve a discussion of agency, political agency in particular, in some significant way. And it will explore the way in which our agency might be thwarted. And my hope is that by unpacking the concept of resentment in this way, we might begin to think more creatively about what might be an appropriate political response to political resentment. If I want to put it differently, I might say that these set of lectures are an exploration of resentment as an extraordinary vice, to adapt Judith Clark's phrase, and to adapt another one of her phrases, they will provide a tour of some perplexities, not a full guide for the perplexed. So let me begin with the first dimension of resentment, what I call authority. I've just given it a label, a placeholder. The possibility of resentment, as Peter Strawson famously suggested in the classic paper Freedom and Resentment, is inherent in any interpersonal relationship. To stand in a relationship with someone is to hold them to normative expectations, and we often feel resentful when those expectations are violated. On this view, resentment is closely tied to our sense of moral agency and moral accountability. To be a moral agent is to be capable of resentment and also to be a possible object of resentment. But within this account of resentment, there might be a distinction to be made between resentment and justified resentment. In principle, of course, one can feel resentful whenever our purposes are thwarted, no matter what those purposes are. Underlying the most disfiguring forms of resentment, there is often a certain kind of narcissism, right? Where anything that stands in the way of our precious self is considered a source of resentment. I could resent, for example, that my love or offer of friendship has been rejected or spurned, or that my parent has not given me more attention than my siblings. Now, there is nothing normatively wrong here. The object of my love or friendship has no obligation to respond to me positively. And my parents were, of course, quite right to divide their attention equally between all their children. The fact that no norms have been violated might even make me feel more resentful, right? Think of the spurned lover in some senses. The resentment might simply be disguised rage at the fact that I'm not the center of other people's universe as I imagine myself to be or would like to be. In many philosophical and ethical systems, resentment, therefore, is often a function of one's ego or self. It is the centrality of this upright pronoun I that is the source of resentment. Resentment is not so much a reactive attitude as a self-reactive one. Dissolve your ego and the resentment vanishes, right? It's only because you're insisting at being at the center of the universe that resentment arises. But there's another kind of problem at another extreme. Resentment could also be the existence of other people. When Sartre famously said, "Hell is other people," he did not, of course, mean, as he put it, that our relations with others are always poisoned or that they're inevitably hellish or that they would always produce resentment. Yet, there is something about the existence of other people that might often seem like a trap. The existence of other people forces us to pass a judgment on ourselves as an object of evaluation, because it is as such an object that we often appear to others. We might come to resent not what others demand of us, but the fact that they could potentially demand anything at all. We just resent the fact that there are any expectations of us at all. The most common experience of resentment arises simply when we are being called to account. Why do I have to justify anything? Or perhaps in a more entitled version, why do I have to justify anything, right? I mean, when I'm called to account, I feel resentful. One can have this thought-induced resentment even if one has very good justifications, or the demand for justification does not thwart our purposes in any way. The mere fact that by demanding justification, someone is claiming authority generates resentment. Now you might say, look, such kind of resentment surely turns on a failure to distinguish between authority and authoritarianism, between legitimate demands of accountability and illegitimate impositions of power. But you might also concede that resentment of this kind has a strange allure, especially for the powerful who are being called to account, because it makes them feel like a victim in some senses. The fact that you feel resentment at being called to account can seem a perverse kind of psychological vindication. There is something to Nietzsche's thought that a life free of resentment might be a life lived outside this space of justification altogether. I am what I am, I do what I do, and that is that, might be probably the most effective bumper sticker for a resentment-free existence. But of course, there are other people, they exist. The fact that you refuse to justify your actions to others, the fact that you refuse to come within a framework of normative expectations, or refuse to be held to account, might be the cause of my resentment, right? Just as you resent the fact that I'm, sort of asking you to give an account of yourself. The very state that liberates you from your resentment, your freedom from having to justify yourself, is the very thing that causes me to resent you. And if the demand for justification can cause resentment, so can the absence of justification. Now, you might say there is a standard resolution available to this problem that goes something like this. This is a kind of standard liberal resolution. If our moral standing were equal, our obligations reciprocal, and if the structures of mutual accountability recognize those facts, we would have no reason to be resentful. The structures of society would be honoring us equally. They would be furthering our goals of social cooperation, which are, after all, our goals. Right? You might say they would be furthering our own will in their alienated majesty, to use Rousseau's phrase. I think there is something to this answer, normatively speaking, but there is an important question here. It might sometimes appear irrational or unjustified, but could we still resent authority, even if it was our own? Like the lover who understands that he has no normative claim over the object of his love, but still resents being spurned, could we understand that authority is justified and still resent it? What are the circumstances under which we succumb to this kind of temptation? Who is allowed to feel or entitled to feel resentful in this way? Right? And what does this temptation tell us about ourselves? At the very least, it tells this, that we feel ourselves to be above some kind of special privilege outside of this fabric of reciprocity, right? Where the mere demand for reciprocity itself generates a certain kind of resentment. Right? It also might suggest a certain kind of disavowal of dependence on others, or a certain kind of disavowal of the reality of dependence on others, where we both, in a sense, partake of and benefit from our dependence of others, without, in some senses, responding in kind by the kind of reciprocity that dependence would entail. But I think the sense of being called into account generating resentment is, a pretty pervasive sentiment. So mark this as the authority fable of resentment, right? I move on to a second trope in this, which I've called sympathy. There is one account of resentment very powerfully articulated in the 18th century, which of course saw resentment as an indispensable custodian of justice. The function of resentment on this account is to, quote, prevent and remedy injury and the miseries arising from it. This is a tradition of thought from Joseph Butler to Adam Smith that acknowledge that while resentment seems like a disagreeable attitude to have, it is actually a crucial motive for seeking justice. The absence of resentment in the face of injustice is contemptible, not just as a matter of character, but morally as well. For this tradition of inquiry, there were only two questions to ask in relation to resentment. When is it appropriate? And what is an appropriate manifestation of that resentment? What is the right pitch in which that resentment should be expressed? And Adam Smith, of course, famously gave the answer that both of these questions required adjudication by what he called the impartial spectator. Could an impartial spectator express sympathy, right, with the resentment that we were expressing? If so, our resentment is then modulated by the desire for that sympathy. It will reach only that pitch that an impartial spectator can sympathize with. Now, the 18th century argument about resentment was, of course, far more complicated and nuanced than this bare summary provides, but I want to point out some features of this account. First, for the 18th century, appropriate resentment arose in the context of a specific claim. The injury in question has to be actual and purposeful, to use Butler's phrase, not an imagined suffering. It arises in the context of a specific expectation or demand being breached, not just a general state of suffering or a lament at the state of the world. In fact, I think both Smith and Butler agreed that it is often difficult for a sympathetic observer to sympathize with a resentment if it takes on the form of a general misanthropy about the world. Right? Second, the appropriateness of resentment that arises in the context of particular injury can, in principle, be adjudicated by third parties. And this is a really important point. There is a shared yardstick by which we can adjudicate whether the claims of the injured party are justified or not. Seeking redress for injury involves an appeal to these shared norms or some shared conception of justice in light of which the resentment could be justified. Third, because resentment is subject to these shared norms, it is also subject to modulation and control, right? We, in a sense, express only that form of resentment that could pass the test, as it were, of this kind of intersubjective justice. Fourth, resentment is in the service of a moral order. The purpose of resentment is to repair our condition and the moral order. This argument does not turn on the fact of whether the cause of our resentment is actually addressed. The expression of resentment can sustain moral order by expressing the reality of the crime, even if sometimes there is no redress to be had. Later in the 20th century, Jean Amery, of course, expressed an even more powerful version of this thought. As he put it, the moral function of resentment is to keep alive the reality of the crime. To quote, "My resentment is there in order for the crime to become a moral reality for the criminal, in order that he be swept up in the truth of atrocity." Giving up on resentment, on this view, is giving up on the truth of atrocity. In some senses, it's giving up on moral order. Now, on a standard story, and this is a familiar one charted by many scholars, as Ashraf, Didier Fansen, this 18th century view of resentment was supplanted in the 19th century by a much more demonic idea called ressentiment, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. And it is ressentiment in some senses that still dominates our thinking about how to think about resentment. I'm not going to give a full account of this transition from resentment to ressentiment, but I think it is worth asking in light of contemporary political developments, what is it that that transition from resentment to ressentiment signified about broader cultural and political changes? So one broad transition in the journey from resentment to ressentiment is, of course, a transition in the understanding of the passions themselves. In the 18th century, there was the view that the passions themselves could be a source of moral order. If left uncontaminated by the machinations of priests or the ambitious rabble-rousing of politicians, human nature was capable of creating a workable moral order. Our moral psychology, including limited sympathy and resentment, would be sufficient to create some form of justice. But as Ernest Gellner and Bernard Williams in different contexts used to joke, trusting passions was fine if you did not understand that they were already constituted by layers of historical resentment. If the passions turn out to be a turbulent ocean, not a placid lake, as David Hume or Adam Smith thought they were, you're less likely to repose trust in them. After the 18th century, it became difficult to think of the passions producing this kind of moral order. Our view of passions became more demonic. Perhaps as the scale of human atrocity and evil increased, the temptation was to dig deeper down into ourselves and how they were constituted by destructive powers they could unleash. So by the 19th century, the idea of resentment has acquired a greater intensity and proteanness. It feeds on itself, burrowing deep into the psyche, and it's not subject to the kind of moral economy that the 18th century thought it would be subject to. It's not contained in that moral economy. It is often directed at one's own self as much as others. And it is not just a motivation to repair our condition. It rather revels in the pleasure of perpetually assigning guilt or blame. Robert Solomon, for example, has described this transition as, in this transition, resentment becomes a more powerful and corrosive emotion than even envy or hatred. Envy or hatred, disfiguring as they are targeted at specific objects we hate. But resentment in this new avatar seems like an endless reproach to the world. And many contemporary theorists worry about the degeneration of resentment into this kind of ressentiment, a series of accumulated resentments, unacknowledged and unaddressed by wider society, can turning into a generalized ressentiment. As Michael Ure once put it, resentment might be the raw material, but ressentiment is the lack of hygiene. It is arguable that with the impact of the French Revolution, the idea of resentment broadened and became more collective. In the 19th century, its use was to explain a certain kind of quietism or exhaustion of political energy. Resentment, as figures like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche pointed out, could be a very creative force, but not one necessarily directed at reordering the institutions of collective life. In fact, in Kierkegaard's rendering, it signified the idea that neither great political deeds nor authentic religious consolation was any longer possible. We are resentful simply because of the fact that we can neither make heaven on earth, nor is there any heaven that we know of that we can ascend to outside of earth. Right? So all that was left of resentment was a kind of misanthropy at the world. At most, a Dostoevsky kind of figure could convert this into a negative form of heroism. Just kind of enjoying, in a sense, living out this misanthropy. Post-French Revolution, it also becomes possible to imagine resentment against a social condition, not just a specific injury. No agent may have intentionally inflicted any specific injury on a member of an oppressed class, but you could still feel resentful at the fact that you are a member of this class, or morally more seriously, that there is in fact such an oppressed class at all. So in the 19th century, resentment becomes a more generalized condition, diffused in two senses. It's a rebellion against one's condition as a whole, both you might say social or cosmic. It's not a demand to repair a specific injury. And it's not clear what form of redress would actually, in some senses, satiate this underlying sentiment of resentment. Now, one of the things I think the 18th century discussion of resentment, brought out, very clearly, the 19th century discussion of resentment, was how conservative the 18th century sentimentalist tradition of resentment was. It was conservative in this sense. Resentment can be a spur to restoring a moral order whose contours had already been defined. Right? But that kind of resentment, in a sense, presupposes a shared set of norms, as I've just actually argued, right? Only in light of which could a specific instance of resentment be thought of as worthy of redress, right? And I think post-revolution, what gets called into question is exactly the existence of such shared norms. Right? In the 19th century account of resentment, there is a specifically anti-theodicy element. This is now a condition that arises not because some normative expectations have been violated, but because we as subjects have normative expectations yet inhabit a world without corresponding ethical rationality. Resentment now marks a vulnerability that comes from thwarted expectations. To live as if the world might be ethically rational, or perhaps give some ground for rational hope, actually opens oneself up to a permanently disfiguring resentment. To put it a little bit melodramatically, if for Adam Smith and Butler, resentment was a motive to justice, for Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, the desire for justice itself is the cause for resentment. Right? Almost a kind of complete reversal. But there's one other, I think, lacuna in the 18th century account that the 19th century exposed. And again, this has to do with the revolution. This is the question of social distance. The legitimacy of resentment requires a shared set of norms, a shared understanding of what counts as an injury, and an expectation that that injury could be addressed. But how are these shared norms constituted? Whose resentment, if any, counts? What is striking in retrospect in 18th century accounts of resentment and justice is, for example, the place of the poor in it. For one thing, the poor are often not thought to feel resentment at all. Resentment is a condition attributed to only those amongst the poor who are ambitious, who wish to exercise agency and commandeer self-respect by aspiring for social mobility. In fact, in most 18th century accounts, the experience of injustice and deprivation, rather than leading groups to feel resentful or seek justice, leads them to inhabit what Tom Scanlon in another context has called non-comparing groups. On this view, hierarchy does not produce political resentment. Hierarchy can equally lead to radical disengagement, where to live a life less burdened by resentment, one simply withdraws to one's own kind. Resentment requires standing in the same social space to some degree, as it were. It requires a minimal degree of interaction and possibility of reciprocity, and often requires that the others be a potential threat or competition. But could there be forms of social separation, right, where people are separated in ways that make them completely invisible to each other? The powerful don't resent the weak since they don't even count at all. To actually resent them is to actually make them count in some degree, right? And so under no circumstances could they be a threat. It is the specter of mobility and competition that arouses resentment, especially in the strong. The weak, on this view, the oppressed, see no point in resenting the strong because it only will reinforce their sense of powerlessness rather than provide a source of power. One of the disfiguring experiences of extreme poverty in this view cannot just be the lack of freedoms, but a condition where the normal human emotion of resentment might also seem like a burden. Moral segregation and psychological segregation can be as much a response to injustice as a resentment directed against the privileged. In Adam Smith's powerful description, the poor were often rendered invisible outside of the ambit of any reactive relationships at all, any framework of normative expectations that could form the basis of their resentment. So despite arguing, right, that sympathy could provide the space for an appropriate kind of resentment, it turned out that sympathy fails us when we actually need it the most. There's nothing to, in a sense, share between these classes. So this is kind of the sympathy trope. Now, arising out of this is another trope about resentment, which has to do, of course, with status and power, something I've already hinted at. What is the form of resentment, then, that hierarchically ordered societies experience? The anthropologist Louis Dumont, for example, argued that resentment as a generalized condition is only possible under conditions of at least minimal equality and individualism. In a hierarchical order where individuals and groups have their assigned place, resentment can usually be thought as arising only when the norms of that hierarchy are being violated. Now, since so much of the history and literature is written by dominant classes, one should be cautious about making claims about the political subjectivity of marginalized groups from most written texts. But what is striking and most pronounced about, I think, descriptions of resentment in hierarchical societies is that they are invoked in the context of people acting above their station. Think of a text like the Mahabharata, for example, whose plotline gains its power largely through dramas of resentment. There are three contexts in which resentment appears most powerfully. The first is the context of familial relationships, where the perception of unequal treatment is the source of resentment among siblings and cousins. The second is the blind figure of the blind king Dhritarashtra, who resents his condition, the fact that he cannot see, and the fact that his wife Gandhari, out of solidarity, vows to go through life also not seeing. The text is interested in how this form of resentment transforms his character. And the Mahabharata is interested in this form of resentment not just as a spiritual matter, but because of its political implications. In monarchies, a resentful identity for the king can, of course, be fatal for the kingdom, perhaps in democracies as well. Right? The third context is, of course, the resentment of Queen Draupadi. And her resentment comes in two forms. One is the resentment against her husbands, who refuse to take appropriate revenge for her public humiliation. And the second is a larger and cosmic resentment at the fact that all promises of restoring ethical order to the world, even by the gods, prove completely illusory. So in a text like this, at first sight, the articulation of resentment seems largely personal or metaphysical. But the politically most salient form of resentment in this text almost always turns out to be related to social hierarchy, when there is a disjunction between the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, for example. Mostly, not surprisingly, these are texts in which Kshatriyas or Brahmins display resentment when they are not accorded the right kind of status. We are supposed to sympathize with the character Karn's resentment because his true status is consistently misrecognized. Often these texts will underscore the fact that this is a hierarchical order by making it a point to show that characters actually don't feel resentment at hierarchy. Think of, for example, for the story of Eklavya and Drona. So Eklavya is this archer who wants the Brahmin Drona as his teacher, who refuses to take him on. Eklavya makes a statue of Drona and says, I hereby kind of treat you as my guru, and practices archery in front of that statue and turns out to be very good at it. Drona is, of course, worried that this new vicarious pupil might be a challenge to his favorite pupil, the Kshatriya Arjun, and he goes and asks for his guru dakshana, the offering you give to your teacher. He says, since you have taken me as my teacher, I'm going to ask you for an offering. And he asks him to cut off his thumb, which of course Eklavya does. Right? And of course the moral of that story is supposed to be, in some senses, Eklavya's complete sort of fidelity to the obligations of discipleship. Eklavya is free of resentment, and the fact that he's free of resentment is meant to reinforce the hegemony of the hierarchical order, right? That hierarchical order has been so perfectly internalized. But it is in fact modern Dalit writers who see in this story traces of caste oppression in their exclusion from the ambit of knowledge, who now resent the fact that Eklavya did not revolt. He should have transgressed, right? And by not transgressing, even though he led a life free of resentment, in some senses, he was just reinforcing the hierarchical order. This is perhaps what Dumont had in mind when he suggested that resentment in the proper sense of the term was possible only in a society where individualism and equality were the norm. In hierarchical societies where people are defined by their social roles, resentment is publicly acknowledged or occasioned only when individuals transgress the norms of hierarchy or cross boundaries. The Kshatriya whose status has been misrecognized, the Brahmin who has not been given his due, or perhaps sometimes even the most adept male philosopher like Janak or Yajnavalk, who has been silenced by the brilliance of women like Gargi and Sulabh. But otherwise in these texts, the Dalit cannot be resentful of the Brahmin. The social distance is simply too asymmetric for them to count. Right? Now, just a little bit of linguistic aside, it's not easy to find exact equivalence of resentment in a text like in Indian languages. Sanskrit, with its infinite variations of emotional register, might seem a promising language in which to find. But it is often difficult to distinguish resentment from related terms like indignation, anger, manu, or amarsh, let's say in Sanskrit. But there is just one, I think, significant instance. If you look at the big compendium of Sanskrit kind of translations, the Rasgandhar Kosh, which has a term it uses for resentment, which appears frequently in these texts. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's called Parikrit Avagya Adi Nana Apradhajanya. The clumsy literal translation means a feeling born of various transgressions due to lack of respect and similar disregard in action of others. And often the lack of respect is occasioned by a lack of recognition of one's social status. This is the kind of theme that, of course, reappears in almost every hierarchical society. In Hobbes's Behemoth, for example, the transgression of hierarchy and the disjunction between status and worth were recurring themes. Gentry and peers could feel resentment towards lordly prelates of humble origin, since men of ancient wealth and nobility are not apt to brook that poor scholars can be their fellows. In 19th century accounts of revolution, resentment was likely to be the cause of revolution, but resentment was not an attribute, in some senses, of the poor or the oppressed. It was usually the attribute of groups that had acquired some degree of social mobility. Right? It's the newly upwardly mobile social classes that were likely to foment trouble. There's a long tradition from Edmund Burke to Robert Nozick that has articulated the thought that the class most prone to resentment is intellectuals, because the perceived value of intellectuals in their own mind, right, disposes them to thinking that they're entitled to more reward and esteem than most societies in fact give them, and they're resentful that their status is out of sync with their own perception of value. Now, in a lot of contemporary invocations of resentment, I think sometimes this competition over status and worth is a little bit marginalized and ignored. And I think it's for one very good theoretical reason, which is that you could argue that in modern society, this competition of status and worth is actually just generalized, right? As Max Scheler had powerfully argued in his work on resentment, the idea that in a society where formal social equality goes hand in hand with wide actual differences in power is always likely to be in a grip of permanent resentment. The gap between what society proclaims to be our status as free and equal individuals and the realities of our social existence might, on this view, be just too vast, opening us all up to permanent kind of bouts of resentment. There are many variations of this argument that the structure of modernity and its unfulfilled promise condemn us to a perpetual politics of resentment. Alexis de Tocqueville had articulated a similar thought, that a society that has declared formal equality might actually make it harder for inequalities to be more politically visible. How can we ask for more equality as a social and economic practice when it has already been declared and granted to us as a postulate? The problem here is not just the gap between theory and practice. Tocqueville's point was that the self-image of our society will not allow bringing to the center of political consciousness what in fact everybody knows to be a fact. Right? The resentment may not just be account of the fact that there is an obvious gap between the claims to equality and the social practice of equality. The thought seems to be rather that articulating this gap becomes more difficult in a democracy because we often take as accomplished what is in fact a task. There's a particular variant of this claim that the late Glenn Newey had, I think, powerfully articulated in a paper, Democracy and Resentment. Newey had argued that it is possible for democratic citizens to experience two forms of resentment. On the one hand, all democracies are prone to procedural anomalies. Who amongst us would argue that existing institutional arrangements of democracies are faithful to the promise of political equality? But again, while this is a well-known, obvious fact, it is very difficult for our democracies to acknowledge this political truth up front center without possibly undermining their own political legitimacy. To put it a little bit flippantly, which winner of an election is going to say, I'm the winner of an election, and yes, by the way, I think the process was not a true reflection of political equality. The validation of any particular winner rests on using the fiction of the normative self-validation of the system. But the self-validation of the system then stands in the way of recognizing its infirmities and defects. The second kind of resentment that Newey had in mind was more substantive. This is where we think that the outcomes of a democratic process do not express our purposes, but consistently thwart it. We might broadly agree on the legitimacy of the process, not just on its self-image, and yet still think that a process thwarts our deepest purposes. One might say that in such circumstances, we have no right to feel resentful, right? We lost an election fair and square. But at a psychological level, this reconciliation is not easy. We often say that allegiance to a democracy is possible only insofar as one thinks, not just that we have a fair shot of winning, but there is actually some hope of winning. But if it turns out that your view is that of a permanent minority, or that this democracy gives very little hope of enacting what might be important to you, just pick any issue. Could be gun control, common good constitutionalism, Ram Raj, racial justice. You might continue to be committed to democratic institutions as being better than the alternative, but that might make your resentment all the more deeper. And they're all the more deeper because your real feelings cannot be acted out, not because of weakness or fear, but because they have been declared illegitimate by the very process that you signed up for. There is something, I think, powerful in this diagnosis, and I don't want to deny its structural force. This is a possibility every democracy has to contend with. Perhaps central to the distinctively political problem of modern democracies is that now citizens lack the relevant relationship to make this kind of resentment productive. In the case of the moral account of resentment that I had started out with, resentment can be productive insofar as it allows for a shared understanding of wrongdoing that can be taken into account via judgment, apology, or forgiveness. In principle, you might think this should be possible in the political case. But in large and diverse societies with vast inequalities, is it more likely the case now that people will not share enough values to make this sort of process of intersubjective adjudication possible? The form in which our democracies are institutionalized might actually exacerbate this resentment in various ways, either by making it impossible for certain groups to have power, or by creating forms of competition that put pressure on groups to demonize each other. But I think as we kind of take on board the structural dilemma of democracy, it is important not to give in to it whole scale. On Shaler's and Newey's account that I just outlined, equality or democracy have an inbuilt aporia that cannot be resolved. But is this too overdetermined? It's overdetermined in one sense, which is that even against the backdrop of the general disappointments of modernity, the politics of resentment is often a very specific phenomenon. Rather than stemming from a modern egalitarian plateau, I would contend the politics of resentment often has more in common with the politics of resentment of hierarchical societies that I had outlined a minute ago. Often resentment is not a product of the politics of the marginalized, those who are most betrayed by the politics of modernity, trapped perpetually in the gap between the promise of democracy and its betrayal. Often it is the product of stronger groups whose power is now vulnerable. It is the product of a status inconsistency. To take one example for India, historically it is quite striking that it is Dalit groups who have in some senses shown the least, as it were, manifestations of politics of resentment. In part because following the figure of Dr. Ambedkar, they have seen the Indian constitution as their constitution. It is often more other powerful groups, powerfully politically dominant groups, right, who are politically powerful but don't feel themselves to be at the center of cultural or ideological hierarchies that actually feel more resentful. So one has to be very careful about specifying the particular groups, in a sense, that are generating the politics of resentment. In short, resentment as inherent as in modernity tropes needs an actual political sociology to go with it. I also think it is important not to give into this overdeterminism, equality, democracy equals resentment, because there is a tendency to slip into a mode of analysis where the source of resentment becomes those who are implicitly trying to close the gap between the self-image of democracy rather than those who want to preserve or exacerbate the gap. As Didier Fassin once argued, there must be some ways, or at least we have to hold on to the idea, between a legitimate resentment and resentment as a general category of explanation. Being victimized at the hands of the police, being excluded from voting, being denied jobs, or being specific must be a different kind of moral claim. The claim is being made in terms of a normative framework that is, as a matter of public reason at least, in principle shared, but disavowed just at the moment we ask someone to make it good. The fact that we think that resentment is a product of some kind of structural paradox of egalitarianism, we are equal but we actually are not, therefore we are resentful, we are democracies but we actually are not, strikes one as too easy. It is perhaps an expression of the fact that we have given up on the idea that claims of justice can be intersubjectively adjudicated, either because there is no shared standpoint from which to adjudicate these claims, or because we think our politics is some kind of dead end. Or to put it crudely, the claim is that today we have lost faith in key features of politics, and perhaps out of intellectual fatigue, we can't stand the challenge to our self-image and kind of throw in the towel. It's the structural paradox of modernity. I don't think it's an accident. This is just a kind of parochial aside for political theorists. I don't think it's an accident that the political theorists most reviled these days are actually liberal political theorists like Rawls and Habermas, whose entire oeuvre is to try and preserve this middle space of justification, that we can reciprocally, in some senses, sort out the claims of justified resentment versus unjustified ones. Right? It's something I think there's a consensus on. Last and final fable, this will be very quick, agency. So, the 19th century was right in thinking that there might be a connection between equality and individualism on the one hand and new forms of resentment on the other. If I become the social measure of a social order rather than being measured by it, do I open myself to greater possibility of resentment? If I am the judge, so the argument went, of when a norm is being transgressed, am I more likely to feel resentful? Because in a society marked by individualism, no transgression can be objectively defined. Resentment now flows not within the settled social channels of which inherited social norm you have violated. It could potentially arise from anything that does not meet my subjective demands. You might say, under modern conditions of individualism, individualism allows all of us to act as the spurned lover that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture, right? Now, one would have thought that a social order that affirmed the moral worth and dignity of each individual would be less prone to resentment than a social order that hierarchically ordered individuals. But on this story, the opposite turns out to be true. Hierarchical social worlds, if they are stable at all, work on an ideological internalization of hierarchy. They often falsely interpret or represent the social order as objective, right? Corresponding to a set of necessary structures, or they simply break down. Even in societies that have very radical intellectual cultures, think of ancient Greece or ancient India, such social structures like caste and slavery are said to be necessary. They're naturalized in some respects. Right? Now, of course, it's very important to be cautious about the degree to which this naturalization is actually internalized, but at least that's the ideological claim of these societies. It is the modern revolutionary tradition that holds out the possibility that structures that define our collective existence can be made and remade by us. They are subject to the tribunal of justification. There is nothing necessary about them. But here we are immediately confronted with one paradox, and this is what I'll, in a sense, end with. As Jedediah Purdy has argued, one of the features of modern human beings is that we are an infrastructure species. We seem to want to re-engineer the planet, influencing everything from its carbon and nitrogen cycles to altering its landscape, including altering our own genes. But on the other hand, when it comes to society, we seem to more generously submit to the constraints of necessity. The standard argument used to be, right, that nature is a constraint, social institutions are an artifice, and therefore we can make and remake them. But the kind of subjectivity that we see on display in our current moments seems to be almost the opposite. We are ready to remake nature in almost every radical way possible, and yet social institutions, think of the necessity of capitalism, think of the necessity of the horizon of the nation state as an operating political form, seem to be much more prominent. As Wendy Brown has argued, individuals at once saturated with human power and yet increasingly alienated from their capacity to act truly politically. Right? We are starkly accountable, yet dramatically impotent. And therefore, to quote her again, we quite literally seethe with resentment. Now you might say, hold on a second, that's too quick. Surely we are making and remaking our social arrangements. A lot of making and unmaking is happening. Think, for example, of the progress we have made in understanding of social hierarchy. Race, caste, gender, tradition, all naturalized categories of social existence are being actually dissolved. Modernity promises the dismantling of these hierarchies. It promises a freedom to fashion a life of one's own ideals. That's its emancipatory potential. But it also means that those whose identities were constituted by these naturalized understandings find themselves under attack, as they should. But then there is an experience of an even greater disjunction. When it comes to the mastery of nature, we act as if we are liberated from the constraints of necessity. When it comes to personal identity, modernity moves us to dismantle any necessary constraints. What is then left at the mercy of quasi-naturalized understandings of social order is our collective arrangements. We think we can remake nature, we can remake ourselves, but our social and political institutions, the realm of politics, is still in the realm of necessity. There seems to be a lot of consternation at the fact that in all democracies, identity politics seems to be important. But to grossly simplify, this is understandable because identity seems to be the only site where politics, in the deepest sense of the term, is actually available to us, where we still believe we can overcome false necessity. So the centrality of identity politics is not due to the fact that we are bringing preformed identities to the public sphere. It is because it's the only realm of our social existence that we think can be appropriately politicized. So here we are, right? I think caught in a sense, in this paradox, and more about it on Thursday. So resentment, if you take this view, turns out to be a condition where we are neither in a position to accept the premises of the current social order, because we all think they should be subject to the tribunal of collective justification, but nor can we envisage the collect means to, in a sense, respond to this challenge. How do we overcome this? I leave it to my discussants, Professor Jamal, Greene, and Katerina Pistor, both of whose work I think has done a salutary, service, to this cause by, bringing the question of politics, of collective arrangements front and center, as it were, to our social existence. On Thursday, I hope to be a little bit more historically specific and talk about three more aspects of the politics of resentment: the necessity of assigning blame, the politics of personification, the relationship between resentment and historical memory, and finally, the relationship between resentment and that which is most fundamental to us, our ability to name ourselves and define ourselves. If you can bear or not be resentful at being subject to another hour of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratap Mehta. I'm Jed Purdy from the law school. I will now bring up the first of our two commentators, my colleague Jamal Greene.
Good evening, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here, such an honor to be able to offer remarks after such a remarkable speech by such a remarkable scholar. I was a law student the first time I ever attended an August university lecture of this sort. It was the Storrs Lectures at Yale Law School, and the speaker was the renowned legal philosopher Joseph Raz. I have two overriding memories of that experience. One memory was just feeling some difficult to precisely locate, but nonetheless palpable sense of pride that I was part of the audience on an occasion on which important ideas were being discussed by an important scholar. The other memory was the distinct sense that I had no idea what Professor Raz was talking about. Now, I have the highest admiration for Joseph Raz as a person and for his quality of mind, which I came to appreciate even more as his colleague at Columbia Law School. That being said, Pratap Mehta has, I think, presented us with a lecture that is equally erudite, but happily more accessible. And to my mind, he's given us something that is not just more accessible, but is legible, which is, I think, a richer idea. Still, in sympathy with those in the audience who may be feeling something now of what I felt back then, and also coming from a law school just across the street, I want to try to do some of what law schools do best, which is to build a bridge between the theoretical and the practical. Professor Mehta has, I think, centered his lecture on just the right sociological vocabulary for these troubled times in which we find ourselves. It's difficult not to feel as though resentment is all around us, and that it's not just a feeling seething inside some of us, and perhaps most of us, but that it's in fact motivating consequential actions on a global scale. Resentment seems to be changing our world in quite profound ways. In the spirit of accessibility and perhaps the spirit of humility as well, I want to diagnose a site and a form of resentment within a more parochial but nonetheless important space, namely this one. This lecture, of course, occurs on a university campus. And it's not just any university campus and not just any building on that university campus, but a building that in the spring of 1968 was occupied by hundreds of Columbia University students. That spring of 1968 is the year of resentment in some sense. And resentment from multiple directions sat at the heart of that occupation and the protests that preceded it. The occupation of Low Library resulted from the confluence of at least three separate grievances. One was the objection of members of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, to the university's association with a think tank whose research was integral to the war effort in Vietnam, as well as a disciplinary action taken by the university against 6 members of SDS for violating the university's ban on indoor protest. A second grievance was the objection of members of the Society of Afro-American Students, or SAS, to the university's plan to build a gymnasium at the edge of Morningside Park that would have had separate facilities access for the mostly white students of Columbia versus the mostly African-American residents of Harlem. A third grievance was internal to the protests. SAS members believed that SDS's message was too diffuse to highlight SAS's main concern, which was over the gymnasium. It was the SAS, the Society of Afro-American Students, it was their demand that white students leave from the occupation of Hamilton Hall that led white students to then occupy Low Library, from which they were later violently removed by NYPD officers. So you had issues of race and issues of freedom of speech, and the intersectionality of those issues of race and freedom of speech. You had student idealism and quite literally matters of war and peace all descending on this campus in 1968. Now, matters on campus today seem not much less resentful, maybe more so. Some students and quite a number of people on social media have come to believe that universities and some of their students are acting in violation of a long tradition of freedom of speech by censoring or allowing the censorship of disfavored speakers, by shielding students from uncomfortable topics. Other students and other people on social media have come to believe that college campuses are places where not all are made to feel welcome, where various forms of aggression, both macro and micro, occur regularly and without adequate interrogation or redress. Race and freedom of speech both continue to play central roles in these debates. But the issues that generate them are, on any fair assessment, less urgent now than they were in the 1960s. Race matters are better now than they were in the 1960s. Low Library was occupied 2 weeks after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Loving versus Virginia, which banned anti-miscegenation laws, had only just been decided. At the time of the protests, about 5% of the country's black population graduated from college. Notwithstanding what you may hear on the internet, speech matters are also better now than they were in the 1960s. Before the campus free speech movement of the 1960s, college was not, generally speaking, a place for radicalism or unfettered speech. It was an opportunity to learn the classics, to obtain a valuable credential, to be socialized into the upper reaches of the American middle class. The policy that precipitated the free speech movement that began on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley, and of which the Columbia protests were in some sense a part, actually forbade students outright from engaging in political activity. That was the policy they were protesting. Here at Columbia, the students who occupied this building were met by thousands of counter-protesters who surrounded Low Library to deny the occupiers access to food and shelter, and water, excuse me. Speech in general is not under greater threat now than then, though to be sure, the range of people whose speech is being challenged has changed. But the fact that matters of race and matters of speech are both materially better in significant ways now than then seems not to have much diminished the sense of resentment. Now, part of this is appearances of a sort. Right? The digital age in which we live has changed how we consume information. And so surely part of the reason we seem to be more resentful is because we see many more things to be resentful about. And there are profiteers and whistleblowers alike who are dedicated to making sure that we see more such things. Far from the information bubbles that are so frequently mentioned as a cause of political polarization, it turns out we're exposed to way many more upsetting things than we once were. It's just that this leads us to be less rather than more understanding of and empathetic towards others. And of course, we don't just see more things that make us resentful, but we also see more people being resentful in ways that we think are unjustified. And we resent them for being resentful, as Professor Mehta has alluded to. Naturally, they then return the favor, and the cycle continues. I suspect, though, that the greater part of the fact that resentment does not align neatly with social facts is that our expectations have changed. We expect not to face discrimination on the basis of race in a wide variety of settings. We expect that the right not to be discriminated against is, like other human rights, universal, and therefore not itself discriminatory on the basis of race or on the basis of other categories of identity. We also expect, and not entirely compatibly, to be able to express ourselves freely, again, in a wide variety of settings, under the authority of a wide variety of institutions. And we expect that also to be universal. Once this kind of claim of right is unleashed, it is difficult to tame. That is, it's difficult to discriminate categorically among those it protects. And in the nature of things, the right grows, tending always to find new ways to assert itself, and rarely discarding its old ways. I want to suggest that a world of ever-expanding rights that are never fully compatible with the rights of others has little choice but to generate resentment, maybe making the slightly too easy move that Professor Mehta refers to. The fact that others who are like us have rights, surely not a reasonable expectation for most of the history of the world, gives rise to an expectation that we do as well. And when our rights are inevitably unrealized, especially in ways that seem unfair, we are resentful. And technology ensures that we will find out, or at least that we will think we have found out. I don't intend this as a statement against universal human rights. so much as perhaps a recognition that resentment may be inevitable when people universally regard themselves as rights bearers. And if it's inevitable and an inevitable consequence of human rights, then it's appropriate to think of resentment as something that well-functioning human societies intend to produce. Not specifically intend to produce, but intend in a general sense, in the sense of knowledge of consequences. Is a society without resentment a society without social or economic mobility? Is it a society without pluralism? Is it a society without universal human rights? And if that is so, then is the challenge less to minimize or mitigate resentment than to be able to identify, to articulate, and to support forms of resentment that are productive rather than destructive? I will expect Professor Mehta to answer that question on Thursday. Throwing it right back at you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Greene. Our colleague Katerina Pistor will now deliver the second comment.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Professor Mehta, if you thought you were humbled by this room and standing here to deliver your lecture, you have to put yourself into my shoes, thinking as a humble corporate law professor to give some kind of comments or response to your speech. I'm reminded of this cartoon where an elephant sits at a grand piano in front of an audience, and you have this little blurb that says, "For God's sakes, I'm a flutist." Having said this, what I want to do in my little remarks is I want to pick up some of the themes. I had the privilege of reading the speech ahead of time, and I will also pick up on some of the themes that will come up on Thursday. But the big topic I want to dwell on is the question of, or the issue of, a political sociology of resentment, which I think is really critical, and it's also probably an area where I feel a little bit more at home than in the high theory world. So at some point, Professor Mehta says in his written speech, one of the best definitions of resentment is when the heart is full and the mind is empty. So I was thinking then, what is then the alternative to resentment? How would we describe that? And I would say it's when the mind is full, and no, not the heart is empty, but the mind steers the heart. So the mind is full and the mind steers the heart, and I would call this a politics of controversy rather than resentment. So the question for me is then, why is it that we succumb to a politics of resentment rather than cherishing and celebrating a politics of controversy? And I think like the politics of resentments, the politics on controversy actually operate at three levels: at expectations, a level of expectations, the level of actual discourse, and the level of outcomes, actual achievements as collectives. So if there is a gap between our discourse and the outcomes, this explains in many ways the rise of resentment, the absence of tangible outcomes that meet expectations. That's when the politics of resentments take over. And for me, the question is, how do we get back to a politics of controversy? We can have different ideas, different opinions. We might also have different interpretations of what we have achieved, and yet we want to battle over it rather than succumb to resentment. The other point I want to make at the outset is that, of course, causality runs in both ways. It's not only that politics creates resentment, but the resentment creates politics. Clearly, politics of resentments may be caused by democratic politics. That's the notion of popularism, and not just because of the messiness of truly controversial democracies. What I was reminded of the Weimar Republic when the legislature was described as a Schwarzbude, as a box full of chatterers that didn't do anything seriously. And yet that chatting, that controversy is exactly what in democracies we should be celebrating. But of course, there's strategic action often used by players to portray what's going on as the politics of resentment rather than the politics of controversy, to turn it into resentment and to instrumentalize resentment for their own purposes. And I think I will come back to that at the very end again, because I think that's really sort of the question of who are the actors that are also gaining from politics of resentments. Is it just reactive, or isn't it also proactive? And if so, how should we understand the political economy of the politics of resentment, not only the sociology? So what I've done, I've basically picked out in all these wonderful fables, these themes, that Professor Mehta has identified that speak to the topic of resentments. I've always picked out a little melody that speaks to me, and I will give it a counterpoint or a little variation, how else one could think about this melody. It's of course highly selective, it's not fully representative, but it's what resonated with me when I was reading his paper. So on the theme of authority, he mentioned this in his presentation today, but could we still resent authority even it's our own? So are we rejecting normativity when we are engaging in a politics of resentment? If that was so, then I think the politics of controversy don't help us. Because then if we reject normativity altogether, even if it's our own making, then we're actually losing the very foundations of a joint polity, as sort of a shared destiny. So I think that's sort of one of the greatest stumbling blocks I had, is sort of what is really standing in our way of having a more constructive policy. If we resent authority altogether, but in some ways I also think it cannot be true, because otherwise many also of the hierarchical old societies could not be or function with less resentment in the way they do. The second fable, the second theme, is sympathy. Resentment, he says, requires standing in the same social space. But where are the boundaries of this space, and who defines the boundaries of this space? We cannot fully take for granted that we actually have a common belonging, not in a globalized world, and even before that, not necessarily, not only because people migrate and leave and go to different places, but also because we have created opportunities for what I would call maybe legal migration. Multiple identities that we can play with and play against the politics of the people. What about status and power? Here, the theme that spoke to me was the politically most silent form of resentment turns out to be related to social status, particularly where there is a disjunction between status and power. But this too raises the question, how is social status attained in different society? How has this changed? We have a better sense, I think, how this happened in traditional societies, or we at least think we do. But the question is how we attain status in our society, in our complex politics, in our sports world, in our university world. Who has status and why? How is this being constructed, and how does that speak then to those who might have been left out or never had a chance to participate in the status building? But even further than that, how important is it that members of my own group or members of groups that might be higher up in the hierarchy or lower respect me in that status? How should we think about this? And on power, the theme is status and power. On power, what form does power take? So if I have less power than my status should confer on me, what are the forms in which power is being expressed? And maybe that's also a theme in our societies where we would expect and should expect that power is expressed through legal means. And they're just because they're fair procedurally. But power can also be expressed in other ways, or maybe even worse, they can be legal, but they come in legal forms that we should not expect. For example, because we are adjudicating a case that speaks directly to our constitutional rights in a private arbitration tribunal somewhere in southern France, it will be enforced against us. So the power they be, how are they being constituted, and how does this relate to what we can legitimately expect of a constitutional democracy for how power might be exercised? The topic of agency, that's also a very interesting one. So resentment then, I quote again, is the condition where we neither are in a position to accept the premise of the current social order, nor can we envisage the means to overcome it. Again, who is the we here? Who is trying to attain the kind of agency? How is it constructed, and by whom? Are we perhaps incapable of achieving our goals because we have succumbed to the politics of resentment? After all, it's much easier to do that than to really live in the politics of controversy, where we have to stand to our words and where we have to battle over these issues rather than to succumb to resentment. I'm now, I think, already touching upon some themes that will come up on Thursday, but since I can't comment on Thursday, although I will listen to you, let me just briefly say something about them here. Personification and memory. Personification can fuel resentment, and this is, as you will learn in greater detail, is why Gandhi was strictly against it. Don't personify. It's not the English, it's the structure of the English. And it's this abstract notion that is so difficult to deal with, but it does play against resentment, perhaps. And then, of course, he says, in the resistance to personify, there's a refusal to specify a particular target, to refuse blame altogether. But the asymmetry is that the structure of oppression seems to always find its particular target. That's this injustice, right? So we don't want to name or personify anybody who is the oppressor, but we always know that the oppressed will be found, and that's one of the reasons for oppression. So that suggests that resentment is bound up with oppression. But will naming the oppressor really be a catharsis? Will it heal the wounds, reduce the resentment? And if so, under what conditions? If I think about truth and conciliation, which would be maybe a procedure that has tried to do this in South Africa, or Rwanda or other places, but we haven't changed those structures yet. If I think of inequality in South Africa today, after all the truth and reconciliation and the quasi-restitution, then it also might be an easy cop-out rather than sort of an adjusting of the deeper structures. In that sense, Gandhi might actually be right. It's the structures, not the English. I would have loved to hear more about memory, and maybe you will expand on this on Thursday as well. Whose memory also are we preserving? Ours, others? What reflects on our own individual and also social worth? I was thinking about this today as I read somewhere that the Mariupol, the city in Ukraine that has been pretty much flattened, that it has the smell of Srebrenica. Who's still thinking of Srebrenica? Where also the males were separated from the families and killed, and many atrocities committed, and yet 30 years later, who's still thinking about these memories? What is keeping memory alive, and by whom? And then lastly, the naming piece, the question of who can name whom and how much do we lose in self-authorship, in the sense when somebody else names us. But the act of being named and classified by someone else without regard to one's subjectivity takes away the power of self-definition, the right to classify oneself. But that's, in politics, is a collective right, not necessarily individual rights, perhaps. So I was sort of thinking about the tension between, isn't it the case that in politics we always classify others, and in doing so are doing exactly this. We're sort of denying them the right to self-classify, but that has to be part of the collective undertaking of politics. Anyhow, let me just sort of come back to the theme of sociology and point out a couple of perspectives maybe in which the sociology of the politics of resentment might be deepened maybe by a political economy of resentment as well. The first theme I mentioned already is resentment primarily reactive or actively produced. Who is allowed or entitled to feel resentful, you asked before. But isn't it also a question sort of who has the means to create resentment? And that, of course, can be both real and imagined. So it's not only that we oppress, but we also create the sentiment that somebody has been oppressed. And of course, in our world of media, this is a big issue. Which brings me to the second big point, which is communication. You say at the end of your lecture that the politics of resentment make communication impossible. But communication also fuels resentment. And again, I think the Facebook and other social media, of course, are well-known examples, but they're only almost contemporary examples of something that we've always seen, certainly since the introduction of some kind of mass communication mechanisms. But even before that, you can think about sort of the access to information, the manipulation of the mind through other means as well. Actors, I think, matter, not only ideas and not only structures. So actors do matter, and so the question is who engages in politics of resentment, who are the beneficiaries. I mentioned already media, we have political parties that engage in this, but also actors who might actually lose in the politics of controversy, and know that they might lose in the politics of controversy, and therefore resort to inciting resentment because that's a way to diffuse guilt, perhaps about past actions, or for their unwillingness to engage in constructive politics in the future. Coming back to the social space issues, and that's probably the thing that I find most concerning in trying to think beyond politics of resentment, which at some level I realize is impossible, but how could we move more toward a constructive politics? So our social spaces are all porous. And again, as I said before, it's not just because we migrate physically, but also we have an enormous flexibility to change our identity in the law, in the very law that also creates our democracies, that creates our collective identities in which we try to fight out our different discourses. So democracy is governance by law and through law, and yet not all are bound by the same rules. Some can pick and choose by which rules they wish to be governed. And those who can of course also then instrumentalize politics of resentment if they wish to deflect the blame that they carry for not being part of the community that is trying to govern them itself, and thereby maybe overcome some of the problems of our democracies today. Okay, to conclude is we definitely need sort of a richer sociology of the politics of resentment. I believe that the political economy, which really makes relations of power and conflict and relations of power that sometimes use the collective resource, which is law and our political system, make that salient in the political economy of resentment. And most importantly, I think we have to be clear about the boundaries of our social networks, which are not necessarily natural. It's not the territorial boundaries. It's, of course, social ties, but also the legal potentialities that we have created for people to move in and out of spaces while they manipulate them beyond the control that we have, especially when we think about the social media today with the technological work. But it's been a pleasure to engage with your work, and I thank you for having me here today. Thanks.
Professor Mehta will come back now to offer some thoughts on what our commentators have said, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments from the audience.
I think there's this old story, right, that a lecture should be judged by the comments it provokes, and I think one could not have sort of hoped for two more brilliant set of comments, and I think they are actually books in their own right in some ways. So, thank you, Professor Greene and Professor Pistor. I won't be able to do full justice. I think some of the questions that Professor Pistor raised, I think, will come up on Thursday, even if obliquely. So maybe just to kick off the discussion, I'll respond to just a couple of things, and perhaps what's common to both comments, I think. Otherwise, we could be here all evening. So I was very struck by Professor Greene's, I think, really insightful remark that there is something about claim making in the form of rights that in some senses exposes us to the politics of resentment. And at one level, it's actually a good thing. I mean, in some senses, it's kind of continuous with the 18th century, that you'd rather be in a position that you actually do think that there is some kind of injustice actually in some senses happening in the world. And if your sense of injustice is in some ways heightened by the fact that you now think of yourself as having rights, it could potentially be, I think, a constructive issue. I guess the counter question in some sense, and this is just derived from your book actually, it's not even a counter question, is whether when we say there's been an expansion of rights claims, whether that is also being accompanied by two parallel processes that look related to rights claims, but are in fact actually quite, I think, in tension with them. So one is whether we actually are now characterizing more and more claims in terms of rights claims, whether that is actually the source of the problem, rather than just the expansion of, in a sense, the number of rights. And I think, as your book has powerfully argued, I'm actually very sympathetic to that argument. I think even in the context of universities, for example, what you might think of as matters that ideally should be adjudicated in form of a social practice or a relationship. Let's say, what's the ideal relationship between professor and student, in a sense, immediately gets elevated to particular kinds of right claims. Or, for example, freedom of speech, where the issue does not seem to be so much the expansion of rights claims, but it seems to be the idea that if you can articulate anything as a right claim, that itself actually gives it a certain kind of legitimacy. So even, for example, hate speech is now, often weaponized as a cause for freedom of expression. And it seems to me that I think a lot of, our inability, in a sense, distinguish between legitimate forms of resentment, and I think this kind of expansion of resentment is a general condition, in part may stem from, actually, in a sense, this confusion that from the very plausible premise that rights are important kinds of moral claims, right? We seem to have often gone to the conclusion that so long as you can articulate a claim in the form of or in the language of rights, that in a sense entitles you to some kind of redress and in a sense makes adjudication actually impossible. So in some senses, I think your book has probably given part of the answer, I think, to your question. The second part, which I think I'm not sure I have a good answer to, and I think I just hinted at in this, which has to do, in a sense, with, I think, the moral claims of reciprocity, where both conceptually and I think historically, the existence of right claims, in a sense, was supposed to be a manifestation of forms of reciprocity that we extend to each other, right? So even something as kind of banally obvious as, let's say, the first principle, we have only such rights as are compatible with equal rights for others, involves some idea in some senses of reciprocity. But of course, you can think of the idea of reciprocity in other kinds of contexts as well. And I think what's interesting to me about this particular moment is not just the expansion of rights claims, but in a sense, the corresponding absence of the reciprocity that is meant to go with rights claims. Right? And I think when Professor Pistow was speaking, it just struck me that maybe some of that has to do with the nature of our information order. I mean, as Professor Greene rightly said, we know a lot more things. Lot more grievances are in fact being aired, and we have a lot more things to be upset about. But does the articulation of actually a sense that we are in a world of reciprocity become harder precisely because so many grievances are being articulated simultaneously, right? So one of the phenomenon you see, right, in almost every, I think, demand for justice, I mean, at least in India, but I can see it in the United States and globally as well, Group A says, this injustice has been meted out to us. And there is a social consensus, this was indeed an injustice, it needs to be redressed. But what will complicate that politics is immediately 6 other groups saying, oh, but what about ours, what about ours, what about ours, right? Sometimes they're legitimate, sometimes they're just using this as a pretext. But is there a certain kind of perhaps even cognitive kind of complexity in projecting a world where you can actually convince lots of different injured parties simultaneously that in fact their grievances are going to be addressed equally at least, or they have equal moral claims. Whereas what often happens in some senses in our politics, and that speaks to Professor Pistor's point, is that which ones we choose to address become then a product of a political economy, a certain kind of social entrepreneurship, perhaps even a certain kind of ideological entrepreneurship, right? And often there is a very systematic political economy to it. So it could be that Professor Greene's point about, I think, the complexity of, in some senses, this information order actually, just reinforces that absence of reciprocity where the redressor or even a particular claim is not seen as moral progress. It's actually seen as further reinforcing the fact that my claim has not been, in some senses, redressed. So that's perhaps one kind of point of connection, I think, between, in some senses, between the two comments. I wanted to say, I think just maybe just quickly, one more thing perhaps about, I think, Professor Pistor's wonderful comment about sympathy. I mean, who are we sympathetic with? Where are the boundaries? If sympathy in some senses presupposes some sense of a relationship, right? I think I want to underscore that point because, and maybe I perhaps did not articulate it well, because that's a point I actually completely agree with. Not just do I agree with, but I think that is actually the heart of the matter. And I think my invocation, in a sense, of the 18th century discussion was precisely to raise that as a question. It is the case that a globalized world makes it easier in some ways to extend circles of sympathies in ways which we might not have. But precisely does the extension of that sympathy on particular dimensions underscore the lack of sympathy on others. In some senses, this is something the 18th century did acknowledge, that if one treats sympathy as a kind of scarce resource, is there a kind of political economy of the allocation of sympathy in some ways? That political economy has gotten much more complicated by the fact of, globalization, in some ways. It also, I think, ties to the very important point you made about authority, and that is something I'm frankly genuinely conflicted with, because I actually do think underlying certain political forms of resentment is actually almost a kind of anger and chafing at the demand for reciprocity. Not all of it is that, but it often just is that. I mean, how come I'm being asked to be, accountable? Who are you to hold me to account, right? And as I said, the easy answer, which is, I'm not fully convinced of it myself, is to actually put it down to, in a sense, a certain kind of inflation of the language of rights and a hyperinflation of kind of individualism, where you are, in fact, like that spurned lover who basically thinks, look, I ought to be at the center of this universe, and I am not. Why am I being asked to, in some sense, account? I actually happen to think that that disposition is probably stronger than we sometimes give it weight to, and it's always been the challenge for normative theory, right? In some ways, I think what's interesting about it, I think politically, is what are the ways in which that kind of disposition finds it easy to make itself politically acceptable? What other kinds of narratives can that disposition? Because at one level, that disposition can be also liberatory. It can be quite anarchist in some ways, which is sometimes a good thing. But what is it about our times that resentment at being held into account can present itself in our politics as a kind of legitimate discourse hiding behind probably some of these other things like the politics of memory and identity. I know that doesn't adequately answer any of the things that you say, but just an opening thought.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me now invite questions. Yes, sir, in back, and then up front, and then over here.
Oh, I'm Sam Zakharoff. Pratap, this was quite wonderful. And I want to take you back, if I may, to the opening of your lecture, where you started by talking about distinctive features of resentment today. And that's the question I have, and it corresponds to the idea that there's a natural boundary of the political sociology of resentment. So in democracy, we worry a lot about the tyranny of the majority, and we rarely see it. And we have a public choice account of why, because interest groups tend to break down. It's hard to hold the coalition of the majority together. And you might consider this to be the natural equilibrium of resentment, because oftentimes interest groups are defined, mobilized, brought into political existence in a democracy through some sense that they're doing it to us, and now it's our turn in whatever way. What seems distinctive if we jump from the 18th and 19th centuries, all of a sudden we seem to see a majoritarian politics of resentment that is astonishingly stable. And obviously India under Modi is as strong an example as you can find anywhere in the world. So I wonder what in your account, maybe it could be the technology, it could be globalization, it could be social media, although I doubt that it's anything quite so simple. What in your account allows this transformation to take hold? At what point does this sense of resentment become a majoritarian force that is not defined in any of the sort of narrower categories that you alluded to in both the 18th and 19th century accounts? So that's my question.
Okay, gosh. Thanks, Sam, for, as always, wonderfully big question. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think this would, in a sense, have to involve a much larger discussion of the nature and character of modern nationalism. And I think one has to be cautious about decrying nationalism just at the moment when Ukrainians are fighting. In some senses, I think, or mobilizing to sort of defend their, I think independence in some ways. I think in the Indian case, and maybe we can see if we can kind of generalize from this in some ways. I think the first, element in that story, which is central to this, is in a sense a construction of a certain kind of memory, and through that a certain kind of identity, right? So